this episode, we bring together everything you have learned about controls, evidence, and responsible data handling and apply it to one of the most practical habits in cloud security: performing assessments that find misconfigurations early before attackers stumble into them. A cloud security assessment is not a one-time audit event, and it is not a theoretical exercise where you imagine threats in the abstract. It is a structured way of looking at your environment the way a curious, persistent attacker would, while still thinking like a defender who wants clear fixes and proof of improvement. Misconfigurations are especially important because they are often simple, common, and devastating, like overly permissive storage access, exposed management interfaces, or identities with far too much privilege. The purpose of practical assessments is to surface these weaknesses consistently, explain why they matter, and prioritize remediation that reduces real risk. When you treat assessments as a normal operating rhythm, you reduce surprises and make security outcomes more predictable. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical assessment starts with scope because you cannot evaluate everything at once, and you should not pretend that you did. Scope means defining which cloud accounts, projects, subscriptions, workloads, and data stores you are evaluating, and what time period and control areas you are focusing on. A beginner mistake is saying the assessment covers the entire cloud, when in reality only a handful of services were examined. Clear scope protects you and your organization because it makes findings defensible and gaps visible. Scope also supports prioritization, since high-value systems should be assessed more frequently and more deeply than low-risk experiments. The goal is not perfection, but repeatability and coverage that grows over time. When scope is explicit, the assessment becomes a meaningful snapshot rather than a vague claim. Once scope is set, the next practical step is building an inventory of what exists, because you cannot assess what you do not know is there. Inventory includes compute resources, storage locations, databases, identity roles, network boundaries, and the services that connect them. In cloud environments, assets can be created and removed quickly, which makes inventories drift unless they are continuously updated. From an assessment perspective, you want a current picture of the environment's shape, including which systems are internet-facing, which systems handle sensitive data, and which identities have broad access. Misconfigurations often hide in forgotten resources that are still running but no longer actively managed. A solid inventory makes those forgotten corners visible and reduces blind spots that attackers love. With inventory in hand, practical assessments focus heavily on identity and access because permissions are the steering wheel of cloud compromise. The most common and most damaging misconfigurations involve overly broad roles and used accounts that still exist and service identities that can do far more than necessary. Assessors look for permissions that violate the principle of least privilege, especially privileges that allow changing configurations, accessing sensitive data, or creating new identities. They also look for risky patterns like shared credentials or identities used across multiple environments without separation. Identity issues matter because they can turn a small breach into full control of the environment. When you assess identity carefully, you are often preventing the easiest path to catastrophic impact. Storage and data exposure are the next major area, because misconfigured storage is one of the fastest ways for sensitive data to leak. Practical assessments look for storage that is accessible more broadly than intended, whether through public exposure, overly permissive sharing, or weak access boundaries between teams. They also consider whether encryption at rest is enabled and whether key usage is properly controlled. Beyond direct access, assessments consider metadata exposure and unintended copies, like backups or exports left in temporary locations. Attackers frequently scan for exposed storage because it is low effort and high reward. Finding and fixing these misconfigurations early prevents embarrassing and expensive incidents that can happen without any advanced hacking. Network configuration also deserves careful assessment, not because networking is always the source of the problem, but because network boundaries shape what is reachable. Misconfigurations here often include management interfaces exposed to the public internet, overly broad inbound rules, or missing segmentation between sensitive systems and general workloads. A practical assessment asks whether systems that should only be reachable internally are actually restricted and whether outbound paths could enable data exfiltration. It also considers whether network-level logging is available to support investigations. Beginners should understand that cloud networking often looks different from traditional on-premises networking, but the core idea is the same: reduce unnecessary exposure and control pathways. A good assessment checks reachability, not just configuration descriptions. Logging and monitoring are another major assessment area because they determine whether you will notice a problem when it happens. Practical assessments check whether the right events are being captured, whether logs are centrally available, and whether retention meets both operational and compliance needs. They also examine whether alerts are tuned to meaningful signals, such as unusual access patterns or large data transfers. A common misconfiguration is having logging partially enabled, where some systems produce rich logs while others are effectively invisible. Attackers look for these blind spots because they can operate without being noticed. By assessing logging coverage and quality, you strengthen both prevention and response capabilities. Configuration management is a quiet but essential component of assessments because cloud risk often comes from drift over time. Even if a system was deployed securely, later changes might weaken it, such as expanding access permissions for convenience or disabling security settings during troubleshooting. Practical assessments look for deviations from expected baselines, including settings related to encryption, access, and network exposure. They also check whether changes are tracked and reviewed, because untracked changes create uncertainty and reduce trust in the environment. The point is not to freeze change, but to make change observable and controlled. When configuration drift is detected early, remediation is typically faster and less disruptive. A practical assessment must also produce findings that are actionable, not just technically accurate. That means describing what is misconfigured, why it matters in terms of impact and likelihood, and what kind of correction would reduce risk. Beginners should notice that good assessment output is not a long list of scary statements. It is a prioritization tool. Some misconfigurations are urgent because they expose sensitive data or grant broad privileges, while others are improvements that can be scheduled. When findings are prioritized and clearly explained, teams can actually fix them instead of feeling overwhelmed. This action-oriented approach is what makes assessments valuable in daily security work. Evidence matters here as well, because assessments should create proof that supports remediation and future validation. When you claim storage was publicly accessible, you should be able to point to configuration evidence that demonstrates the exposure. When you claim an identity had excessive privileges, you should capture evidence of those permissions and their scope. This evidence is useful for audits, but it is also useful for internal learning because it shows exactly what went wrong and how it was corrected. Evidence-driven assessments also reduce disagreement because teams can see the facts instead of debating opinions. A practical assessment, therefore, becomes both a diagnostic tool and a teaching tool. Another essential aspect is follow-up, because an assessment that does not lead to verification is incomplete in practice. After remediation, you want to confirm that the misconfiguration is truly resolved and that the fix did not create unintended side effects. Verification can include rechecking configuration states, confirming access boundaries, and ensuring logging remains intact. This verification step closes the loop and turns assessments into continuous improvement rather than one-off reports. Beginners should understand that attackers return and misconfigurations can reappear when systems change, so repeated assessment and verification builds resilience. The rhythm of assess, fix, verify, and reassess is how mature cloud environments stay secure over time. Ultimately, practical cloud security assessments are about being honest with your environment before an attacker forces that honesty on you. They surface common misconfigurations in identity, storage, networking, logging, and configuration management, and they translate those discoveries into prioritized actions that reduce real risk. When you combine clear scope, accurate inventory, evidence-based findings, and verified remediation, you create a security posture that improves steadily instead of lurching from incident to incident. This approach aligns strongly with risk management compliance readiness, and responsible data practices because it produces both better defenses and better proof. The most important takeaway is that assessments are not a special event reserved for audits. They are a practical habit that keeps cloud security grounded in reality.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.